Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Giacomo Valzania. I'm a PhD student in architecture at McGill University. And I mainly do research on post-war suburbs. In particular, I'm looking at Toronto, and I'm very grateful that Davis today in the morning presented a very nice presentation, gave a lot of context actually to what I'm presenting now. My presentation consists in a personal reflection on the opportunities and limits in representing the way suburbs are changing or might differently change in the future. I'm doing this by exposing a quite emblematic case of controversial and emblematic case of transformation that is happening now in Toronto. But before exploring the case, I want just to say a very obvious thing, that not post-war suburbs are all the same. And it's really important to acknowledge the difference in historic terms, in spite of our imaginary of cul-de-sacs, single-family homes, and private backyards. And I think the case of Parkway Forest, there's a modern suburban community in North York, as big as the white spot that you can see in the map, will make it clear. In fact, the neighborhood followed a model common to many design-based suburbs in Toronto. It accounted for a great diversity of housing types, which coexisted with infrastructure, services, and landscape. From these images, you can appreciate how the model of towers in the park was particularly applied in the neighborhood as direct legacy from European modernism. As many North American suburbs in the 60s, the car was obviously the primary means of access. And you might notice that very little has changed in the last 50 years, 60 years actually. This is Highway 404 for who is familiar with Toronto, and Parkway Forest is just on the right. However, in spite of the persistence of certain habits, the social patterns inhabiting post-war suburbs are very different from the one they used to be. And a complex series of causes implies that today mainly low-income immigrant population live in the neighborhood. The lack of maintenance of tower buildings in particular make evidence of existing inequalities that are geographically traceable. And these images are from a protest against the unbearable condition of one building in our neighborhood. You might think that is like in a just city with a strong care of welfare and equal opportunities for all would accordingly respond and prioritize specific interventions, but this is not the case. Toronto's future is one of growth, of rebuilding, of urbanizing, and of regenerating the city within an existing urban structure that is not easy to change. Population growth is needed to support economic growth and social development within the city and to contribute to a better future for the region. This is not from a developer's website, this is from the city community plan. After the arrival of the new subway line at the turn of the century, and a successful, actually, redevelopment application, Parkway Forest was rebranded under the name of Emerald City as the capital city of Land of Oz in Frank Baum's books. From a comparison between what still exists in 2009 on the left and a new planning community is obviously hard to grapple with what many scholars have meaningfully called post-suburbia. And I became interested actually in Parkway Forest by studying the master plan and the report that was associated to it. I thought was particularly controversial in the intention stated by the authors WZMH architects to preserve the feeling of tower in the park while at the same time adding 2,200 new condo units to the neighborhood. In practical terms, as you will see, the towers were preserved while wall caps and townhouses were demolished to urbanize the available land. We might read the intervention as largely replicating strategies of development going on in Toronto, from the selling of units through deciding renderings to an history of political implication in planning to shape development. For example, in this series of images, you can trace the tactical addition of new building in the selling of in the selling process of units in a way to do not impact existing building. So I found Michel Desserteau's words still very actual. Today, fiction claims to make the real present, to speak in the name of the facts, and thus to cause the semblance it produces to be taken as referential reality. Hence, those to whom these legends are directed and who pay for them are not obliged to believe what they don't see. This is a very traditional position. But rather to believe what they see. is a contemporary position. So my engagement with the neighborhood began at a time when the last phase of construction had just started, and approximately half of the units were occupied. I had confessed that my first reaction before starting fieldwork was to somehow counteract the fictional dimension of virtual images. However, I ended up considering photography as necessarily partial means of representation, in spite of its supposed objectivity and my initial pretension for comprehensiveness. Beyond the question of point of view, it was the resulting complexity of redevelopment, where existing buildings and new ones collapsed in hardly discernible wall, and open spaces challenged categories such as natural versus artificial to make vanish any purpose of comparative analysis. Emerald City saturates visual experience at the point that photography could only work as a collection of fragments, as incomplete inventory actually, and necessarily ask for other layers of representation. So as an attempt to compensate this lack, I start by narrating the transformation through concept that, as they have been emerging in my study, I hope to complement images in conveying what the post-suburbia might be about. So the redevelopment of Parkway Forest has inverted physical hierarchies as they existed among townhouses and apartment buildings in post-war suburbs. In fact, while modern towers used to dominate the skyline in these landscapes, the verticality is conceptually halved by new construction. The high-rises propose for infill shade modern buildings, not only for a question of height, but also in a more sophisticated vertical articulation of parts. Hierarchy bases the relation among new added buildings. So townhouses and mid-rise blocks are placed just contiguously to towers to maximize and diversify buildings typologies. This strategy further accentuate hybridism, whereas in modern landscape, by contrast, different buildings typologies were well divided by service roads and open spaces. At the same time, the dependence on private vehicles to access the neighborhood has implied addition of roads, and in the case what designer called the gate, so the northern access in front of one of the largest shopping malls of the city. Cars obviously need accommodation inside the neighborhood and influence its landscape. In Parkway Forest, design attention for protection counteract the precarious proximity of new buildings and the busy arterial roads service them. This happened through both the exploitation of a landscape barn on one side of the community and through the use of podium buildings on which new towers sit. As such, post-suburban landscapes are more urban in the reinforcement of physical boundaries and separation of a noisy outside from a protected interior. Through form, new buildings convene defense and, more broadly, a sense of community built on privacy. As repeatedly stated in the context plan, a goal for the new development was creation of private open spaces as public ones for a question of property. This entailed the treatment of internal roads as replicas of traditional urban streetscapes, with artworks, sitting areas, sidewalks, flower beds, light poles, and other furniture used to complexify the walking and driving experience. More generally, Emerald City reversed the lack of program of modern landscapes through an hyper-detailed design of open spaces in a way to enhance their use. While spaces surrounding towers once lacked official designation, post-suburban spaces are obsessively programmed. As such, modern functionalism is not simply opposed, but rather re-elaborated under preoccupation of completeness. Nature is used to compensate for added density. However, it primarily absolves an aesthetic role instead of acting for ecological performance. This implies obviously control too. Video surveillance, anti-trespassing signage, and occasional restriction of amenities still leave doubts about what rights visitors and residents have in the delicate balance between private property and public users. But even the more obsessively programmed open spaces can obviously be appropriated. In times when one entire block still has to be built, Parkway Forest hardly conveys the previous feeling of towers in the park for the casual observer, which is reframed as privilege for some residents overlooking the community park from the elevation of their units. For them, the initial intentions of designers and developers were actually well achieved. The transformation of the neighborhood has been a time-compressed undertaking, and when we relate the project to the temporality of its construction, it is natural to question the process behind the materiality that pictures, as subjective fragments, can help documenting. So I tied together images and concepts to somehow compensate for the insufficiency of the former. However, in concluding, I would like actually to highlight some opportunities that photography has revealed in a direct experience of the changing neighborhood. The first aspect will be primarily for the next transformations, and will consist in documenting modern landscapes whose state of vacancy condense them as next targets for intensification, marginal areas, underused sport fields, and green spaces. While it's easy to argue for their wastefulness, at the same time, they maintain opportunities for landscape connectivity, unpredictable uses, and ecological performance. As such, they can be re-envisioned in ways diverging from intensification through build form. Photography, by documenting them, can enable fruitful discussions and sharing of ideas among a multiplicity of stakeholders. The second potential of photography is to tie transformation to its surrounding effects. After the first phase of development was concluded, the school in Parkway Forest reached capacity, and it was necessary to add portable classes in the courtyard, where many kids still learn in the harsh condition of Toronto's climate today. In spite of intensification, the location of the school expansion was not foreseen. So by expanding the boundaries of study and not limiting us documenting transformation per se, photography can critically engage with larger effect of change. The same can be achieved in connecting site perception to other documents describing transition in qualitative and quantitative terms. For example, in this case, through building application, I've learned about the process here. I'm interrelating the authorized number of units on site with the development in a way to document negotiations, political negotiations that went through the process. And overlapping this information to images can create new tensions and lead to a more nuanced description of suburban change. Finally, I would like to conclude saying that this experience is driving me to question the importance of drawings and consequently the role of design-related professions. Given the ephemeral fixity of renderings and the saturation of collective and active imagination that hyperrealism implies, what opportunities does drawing maintain beyond the purpose of mere seduction? In this image, for example, I mapped the informal paths existing in private properties in a neighborhood near Parkway Forest, and crossed with trees and topographies and parks. This, in a way, better describes social practices surrounding build form. Similar three-dimensional images do certainly empower collective understanding, but I had the feeling actually that sometimes abstraction is perhaps necessary to leave room for kind of contamination of initial design strategies. So simplified but rigorous drawings can be fruitful to create handbooks for suburban change, complementing growth as form-based densification, with alternatives focusing on incrementalism, temporariness, adaptability, and use of common spaces. And this can obviously be extended to different cases of micro-landscapes and build a fruitful collection of different opportunities. In fact, I have to say that we have seen how Parkway Forest has been built very quickly, but it will likely remain as such for centuries. And I guess that my main preoccupation in this moment is if we can actually afford the same absolutism in future change of modern landscapes, or if it will be better actually to engage in processes considering alternatives for more inclusive forms of adaptation. And I'm very grateful for your attention and patience. Je vais prendre les questions en français aussi, si vous préférez. Yes.
Hello. Just a quick question about the renderings, which I guess were sort of like the starting point of your thinking process. So my question is actually, where do we see these? The reason why I'm asking is because there's a very popular practice where I come from in Beirut, whereby these they make their way to the construction fences around the buildings. So they're very much part of the of the urban landscape, so to speak, and they're not just in sales brochures and real estate websites. So I just wonder, where do we see these usually? Do we see them around the city at all?
You mean the fence?
The renderings, yeah. These kinds of representations of the projects to be.
Okay, so I actually took them from the developer's website, but like you can easily see them like surrounding construction sites in the city.
Similar practice.
Yeah. Well, what is actually interesting from this selection is that, as you can see, depending on the phase of the process, we were units that were already programmed, already planned, were added just to convene a feeling of, kind of inclusion into the nature, whereas they had already thought actually to build beside. So people were addressed to buy, thinking that that was actually the result that was going to happen. So it's kind of very dynamic use of hyperrealism, yeah.
J'ai juste une question sur les... je ne suis pas certaine d'avoir bien compris les dernières images qu'on a vues avec les cercles. Il y a donc une progression temporelle à partir du bas vers le haut, l'autre après. Ouais. Donc c'est une progression temporelle, j'imagine, qui va du bas vers le haut. Est-ce que les choses qu'on voit en rouge dans les dessins, est-ce que c'est la proposition d'un projet? J'aimerais juste mieux saisir cette image-là.
So there are obviously 4 different kinds of micro landscapes. So they are like selecting types of suburban spaces, and like for each one, I'm basically this actually comes as an exercise along my studies. Like the first line that you see, like the first series would be kind of a more, attempt of gently add volumes to existing neighborhoods. The second one is more kind of working on the idea of using and public space, common spaces and connecting them. And like the third option will be in the case of crisis, so where people actually will possibly in the future live the suburb. How do you, in a way, deal with abandonment of people and kind of preserving the use of certain buildings? So in one case is intensification, in another one is kind of stagnation, so the idea of like improving public spaces. And the last one will be an idea of partial demolition and reconfiguration of buildings, what alternatives would be. But actually this might be part of the next presentation. Obviously it's a different topic, but like the idea is more kind of a reflection on the way we can represent to make to offer different opportunities of change and not just like one perspective. Yeah, perspective and not just one solution.
Hi. I think the question I have is related to your work, but also maybe a kind of broader line of thinking about the day, and it has to do with the relationship between photographs and drawings and how kind of the development of methods for investigating the sort of topics that you're interested in. And I'm curious about the moments where you feel like you need to switch from photographs to drawings, and how that occurs, why that occurs, the kinds of drawings that you discover are needed that address issues that are not being represented in the photographs, and sort of how one might move back and forth, and how you might develop a kind of way of working that is, somewhere between these forms of representation. Right. I think that's a question maybe that is kind of broader, it's not just for you, but it makes, like, how you go from these kinds of drawings to these really evocative photographs. Like, I really want to know how that works, how in your mind you shift back.
Well, it's a very interesting question, actually. I had the feeling that there is no way for a synthesis that is common to the different techniques of representation, but it's much more about the coexistence of them. So I'm not actually pursuing a kind of final product that is able actually to synthesize them. And I think like this feeling came from the real experience of the neighbor that as a priority, like in my work methodology. And like my argument about the impossibility through photography actually to represent these kind of landscapes primarily depends on the type of landscapes that are produced. So it's just not a kind of very general judgment, but it's really like kind of direct experience led me to think about that. And I think, like, as I said, more like the main reason for photography not being able to fully represent them is for, I guess, for the complexity of adding these kind of new buildings to existing one, but at the same time kind of changing what exists, and like this obsession also for kind of the correction of public space and the beautification, and the obsession for designing everything until the smallest detail, in a way complicates the use of photography in this sense. I don't know if I kind of answered, but yeah, we might actually talk about it later.
Merci, Giacomo.